But that mode of thinking and operation, that ability of trying and falling over and trying and falling over and aspiring and achieving and working out, that's the genesis of competency. And it requires resilience to basically be prepared to risk and fall over and see yourself as failed and to learn from those failures.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the first thing that develops resilience is that mindset. And I'm always intrigued when I see it in people. And so, very simply, you rarely see resilience in people that haven't had hard times. And much as we would like to avoid hard times are what tempers us.
Mm-hmm.
It's where resilience and that process I talked about is truly honed at the edge of our emotional tolerance. And one of the most corrosive things I think we face today is the issue of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And self-responsibility, because the truth is important, not because I can say I'm right and you're wrong, but because actually the truth is also a measure of, are we correct or not in our worldview? Can we learn from the failures? Can we take responsibility and grow? And so one of the problems when you obfuscate the truth, as is happening not just in Trump's regime, but also, for example, in the UK, in Starmer's left regime, is actually the truth disappears. You can't evaluate success or failure. And how can you evolve? And if you can't evolve, you can't adapt. And if you can't adapt, you're really just walking dead people. So the truth is actually very important. The search for the truth has to be, I think, a key pillar of this questioning as to what is or isn't real.
Welcome to The Competent Man. Today I sat down with David Murrin. We went over the ideas of understanding the importance of lateral versus linear thinking, building resilience, and where dyslexia can be extremely useful within society. Just as a reminder, all of David's links can be found in the show notes. Let's get to it. David Murrin, welcome to The Competent Man. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Tom. It's a great compliment to be on The Competent Man, because that must be, I'm possibly a competent man.
Well, of course, there's many different aspects to being competent, to, let's say, what I would define that as, what you would define that as. And, you and I have had so many interesting discussions outside of a recording. That's why I wanted to have you on the Competent Man, because there are so many different subjects that you and I are interested in and think about that are really key, I think, to being competent, to understanding not only what to think, but especially how to think. So you shared with me before that you are dyslexic. That's not something that I personally grew up with. That's something that I have read more about, that I've learned more about as our discussions have progressed. And of course, you told me that you were dyslexic, that you kind of grew up with that, and you've developed an interesting framework around how to think about it, how and really what value it actually brings to the world. So if we could, would you mind starting with kind of how you grew up and, let's say, gained an understanding of dyslexia, how you grew to understand it and used it to excel within this linear world of ours?
It's such a great question. And I'm really happy to share my journey, because hopefully it'll help other people ease their passage. I was brought up by two parents who were well-traveled, very worldly, in a time when England was pretty myopic, having lost an empire and imploded on itself. And my mother came from a background where all of her kins would have gone to a public school, which over here is a paid school. And my father was much more egalitarian. He believed his children, if they were going to sink, to get on with it and throw them in the deep end. And so off I went through a state school system. And primary school was, sort of like fun. It was quite lateral in terms of making robots or painting or artistic. But I remember I actually finally managed to write 2 pages. And in fact, everyone nodded their head because there were 2 pages of David's words, but no one could understand what it said because my spelling was just so bad. Mm-hmm. And my parents just despaired. They didn't really understand what it was. And, they got some extra English coaching, and English coach was just probably appalled at how slowly I learned. Although I obviously wasn't stupid, I just didn't deal with words. But there was no phrase to describe what dyslexia was at that stage. Mm-hmm. And this carried on, and I went to the middle school, and my mother was, really admire her for doing this, and she decided to find the best educational psychologist available. There weren't many in those days. So off we went to London, where I was educationally sort of profiled to a psychologist at the age of 10 and a half or whatever. And I remember we ended up in the headmaster's study, and she shared with him the results. And she said, first of all, look, David is dyslexic. I mean, no one knew what dyslexic was. Mm-hmm. And he was sort of, okay, all right, I think I understand that. And then he said he has an IQ of X, at which point he fell off the back of his chair. Now, that was a really important moment for me because I knew I wasn't stupid. I didn't think I was stupid before, but I really knew I wasn't stupid after that. And the attitude towards the teachers changed slightly. I was no longer, a sort of average person as they claimed I was, and, no longer treated like an average person. And there was a beginning of self-belief as a result of that cycle, which is the first corrosive dynamic that I think dyslexics face because they don't learn the same way. They're slow learners. And we'll come on to what I think is going on inside all of us who are dyslexic in that process. But nonetheless, there's a certain, well, actually, you can do more. And then gradually through the next educational establishment, which was really like a young Borstal, even though it was none of us had committed crimes, or half had and half hadn't, essentially. And then I started to edge my way up through the academic standings into the top sets and the top of sets. And I started to see the evidence that I really wasn't stupid and this is how it worked. But it had all sorts of spasmodic challenges. Like in English, it was just impossibly difficult to get beyond, the basic level of English or English literature. Whereas in science, it was incredibly easy to manifest something. So that journey continued. And what I noticed was I got better with time. I remember, when I was going through my A levels, which is a 16 to 18-year education over here, and I studied physics, chemistry, and maths. And I remember explaining to my physics teacher that essentially I planned to go to university to study physics. And the bastard fell off his chair laughing. He said, "You're not going to do that." I said, "I absolutely am." And so even at that stage, there was a sense of just, lack of appraisal of potential because I didn't manifest in a way that others did. And I now understand it was because I was busy assimilating information to create what I would describe as a three-dimensional hologram dotted with information that then you interconnect to create an understanding of the world. And of course, whereas most educational processes accept this linear string and then regurgitate it, it takes time to populate and build this three-dimensional holographic way of thinking. And the accumulation of my sort of academic presence came as I went to university and I studied physics and I went through the process and I got better and better as I got academically more mature. And I would argue that my three-dimensional hologram became more and more populated and I used it to break the codes of things other people didn't. And that hallmark was there early on. And we had one physics professor who was the scariest, sharpest of all of them, a PhD and just super sharp. And when he came around, he would scare the crap out of us because he'd ask the most difficult questions. And I felt I'd never even got off the pay grade. And I remember it came to my final year, I'd taken my exams and they gave everyone at certain levels of Viva. And so I went to him and I said, "Look, I've never had a Viva, which is terrifying. It's 3 or 4 hours of being grilled on any topic in physics ever. And you had to think and rationalize through the experience with a professor who, would ask you the most difficult questions." So I went up to him and I said, "Look, this is crazy, but I really am going to ask you to give me a practice Viva because I've never had it before and you're the toughest person I can imagine." So I had 3.5 hours of grilling. I have to say I was really on form more than ever. And he just said, "I always knew you were brilliant." And I mean, it was like the moment where suddenly all of that doubt and questioning that had come through a whole educational process disappeared because there was a man I most respected telling me he saw something in me. And that was, I can't tell you what that did. That meant on top of how I ended up with my degree, it also meant that I really had been affirmed. And from that point onwards, I couldn't deal with languages. So I wasn't going to speak French. I could scrabble with Papua New Guinea in the jungle. But for that moment onwards, I had an academic confidence that there was nothing that I couldn't intellectually challenge or face or confront or think through. And that was the greatest gift of my education. But if I think about the whole period before, it was about being underestimated, unseen, and diminished, and never encouraged to be where my potential was. And if I'd perhaps been to a better schooling system rather than our glorious state school system, that might have been different too. But I suspect it wouldn't have been unless I could have gone to a school that understood neurodiversity and lateral processes. And I found just such a school for my children. And they've been through it, and all three of them are thoroughly dyslexic. They've been given support at the key moments, and the result of it is they've migrated through the system with a completely different experience because the educational system understands they learn later. And that means later, just before their A levels, they suddenly turn the tap on or do surprising things out of nowhere because they're doing this intellectually and academically. And so it was tough, but I came out of it with the most wonderful experience. And I suppose in a strange way, the exposure to that form of education taught me about people, because going to school with a mixed cohort, maybe not as privileged as I was, and my accent made me stand out like a sore thumb, taught me that unless you could physically protect yourself, you were not going to do very well with some of the rough elements of society. So I understood that outside my social construct, where violence wasn't acceptable, violence was acceptable to some human beings, and they were ready to use it, and you weren't free unless you were prepared to counter it, and you signaled that essentially they would suffer if they did. And I always studied martial arts, which is why I was able to think and do like that. But it was a visceral lesson that I can see in nations and countries as history unfolds in front of our eyes. Those countries not prepared to defend themselves are most exposed to be attacked. Mm-hmm. And so that life lesson from school translates to the geopolitics of today.
David, when we think about this idea that you mentioned about the support that you got, you mentioned that basically this educational psychologist didn't exist for most kids at the time. Is there more of a prevalence of, let's say, dyslexic within the prison system because they didn't get the type of support and they kind of end up down a wayward road because of, let's say, this unrecognition through the school system?
Well, so obviously being this dyslexic person and thinking differently, instead of thinking I'm unique, and I started to think, well, what part of the process do I see in others? And so I quickly, when I was on the trading floor at JP Morgan, had this strange encounter where I was seeking of, say, 100 risk takers, why 5 were really good at predicting tomorrow and the other 95 weren't. And I started to highlight one of the first hallmarks was I was left-eyed and right-handed. Mm-hmm. And then I started to realize that these guys were left-eyed and right-handed, or some left-handed. And so I started to realize in men especially that there was some agency of lateralization which enabled them to think differently about the present to the future. And the more I made the discipline of risk-taking and directional trading my art form, the more I studied what I really described initially as a lateral thinking person, mm-hmm. a lateral thinking male. And in that process, there's we have 2 hemispheres, and I would argue that men's hemispheres are less connected than women's hemispheres across the spectrum, which is why the whole process of women can multitask and men can't. Well, a man that can't is a very linear man. A man that actually is lateralized can multitask, but women generally have a higher level of the 2 brain sides operating and communicating. So I started to really think about this, and everywhere around me, I saw people fall into these 2 categories. Much more with men, they were much clearly delineated, but I could see extreme versions of lateralized women appeared in different times before me. And I conclude that it's almost as if we are 2 subsets of humanity. And I think that I've developed my arguments to think of lateral people tend to come back from hunter-gatherer genes, and linear people tend to be part of the agrarian population explosion. And that proportion is sort of 70-30. And so 30% of most populations are, lateral and 70% linear. And the more maritime and sea-based a system is, the more likely it is to move towards the 30, and the more land-based it is, the more likely it is to move towards a lower number of maybe 25 or 20, because environment does shape that propagation. And then within the lateral group, I now argue that 66% are probably dyslexic. So dyslexia is far more a hallmark of this lateralization process, a more extreme version of it, which also I think is linked with the leadership gene. Mm-hmm. Because when you go and look at great leaders and great innovators and generals, and scientists, they're all lateral, very clearly. And dyslexia is well and truly linked to that process.
Mhm.
But instead of thinking about dyslexia as as a problem, actually what it really represents is a gift. But there's a problem with a gift. And the gift is, if you have a high IQ, you can drive that process. But if you have a low IQ, you really can't make the process work and adapt. And so there's another hallmark which I think is very clear. Lateral people don't see boundaries in society the same way. They're not part of group behaviors. They have a separation from the group, and they see rules as something to get round rather than respect. And the smarter people understand that if you break some of those rules, there's consequences. And as you move down the curve to the not so intelligent portions, essentially they don't have a rule based like respect. They see ways to break it. They're not smart enough to break it without being caught. And prisons are full of dyslexic people as a result. 55% of prisons in the US and UK are dyslexic. And essentially the proportion is more like 15, 20% of the population.
Mhm.
So there's a really interesting dynamic. Now, if you take those people and you put dyslexic people that are in prisons in war, all of us go, oh, you're releasing the criminals, what are you doing? But in fact, I'd argue that mindset is ideally placed suddenly to go to war, because lateralization in war is a winning quality. It means you do things that are unexpected. You think differently. You adapt on your feet. You think under pressure. And so it's almost as if in peacetime they don't have a place to go, so they break the rules. They don't have the intelligence to go and functionally produce in the way that you would most think they could do. So they break the rules, they get caught, they go to prison. Then they get reinforced with other inmates who turn into a profession, and now they become systemized professional villains. But in wartime, empty your prisons and put those people in command, and they become corporals and sergeants and be very effective.
Mhm. David, before we continue too far here, let's give a bit more of an understanding or a definition to lateral versus linear thinkers, and so that we can understand the main differences there.
So, if you have a problem-solving environment where you'd most see it, and, there's a large wall, and the question is, to the linear person, you've got to get over the wall. And, they're looking around for ladders and they get people to climb on, and there's not enough people to get over the top of the wall. And the lateral person looks at the wall and thinks, I bet you it's not like infinite, and walks along a bit and finds it only stops around the corner and goes around the corner. He just thinks differently, or she thinks differently. So lateral is problem solving, adaptation, which I think goes back to being a daily life's experience of a hunter-gatherer. And linear people tend to accept boundaries, accept limits, accept the information they're told and the constructs with which they think, whereas lateral people just break those constructs, which is the reason why they actually rule break. Naturally, they're rule breakers because they challenge everything they see. Mm-hmm. Only they've got to understand that some rules you should break and some rules you shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. And then going back to this idea of, let's say dyslexic within the prison system, do you think that line is mainly defined around, let's say that lower IQ with dyslexia versus higher IQ with dyslexia?
I think so. I do. I think, and you did touch an area is, a dyslexic person is not going to function well in school and develop any academic criteria, which gives them a chance to be successful in everyday life. So they look at their options and they're more likely to become villains because that was the only option. So you've got an educational problem and the potential that goes with it. And then you've also got this function of lack of respect of boundaries, and therefore the ease to slide through the boundary of criminality. Mm-hmm. And the net effect is that, yes, I think that you're looking at the lower portion of the profile of dyslexic IQ ending up in that space. But I go back and say that very same space in war would be the stalwart of your armed forces. They would be great natural combatants. Mm-hmm. So it's a question of peacetime, and what do? Oh, in wartime, they join up. Mm-hmm. And, and so they're an asset. And I think instead of looking at them as, especially one of the problems that we're about to go through, my theory with AI, a fundamental shift in human evolution. Because if I'm correct, and there are two human subsets, the lateral and the linear, we've worked in symbiotic dynamics, which often, believe it or not, involve argument. Because we don't like people who don't think like us, mm-hmm. both sides. So one would stamp the other out. But the truth is, we can work brilliantly symbiotically. if you have a lateral person creating a plan and a linear person implementing the detail, and they respect each other, that's great teamwork. And I strongly urge people to think in those terms. But there is a substitute roaring ahead of us, which is AI. And AI is predominantly, at this stage, a linear tool.
Mm-hmm.
So a linear tool replaces the linear portion of society. Robots represent the linear portion of society that create repetitive tasks. So if there is a section of this society we live in that faces endangerment generationally, it's the linear contribution that's replaced by AI and robotics. Mm-hmm. Whereas as lateral people can still think out of the box and creatively, they have advantages. So it's something that's never been talked about. I've never heard anyone talk about this. But, I notice it because when I use, AI, I write 10 times faster. It corrects my poor English. It lets me do things I could never have dreamt on before that, people who didn't have dyslexia would find natural. So suddenly it's enabled me to go and match them on an equal level and then use my ideas in a completely different way. Mm-hmm. So I think we are seeing a quantum change, which is a whole portion of human society potentially moving through an extinction event. So we need to have educational processes that encourage, where it is possible, and I've never seen it because we never created, taking linear thought processes naturally and encourage the muscles that make them more lateral. And we need to do that. Otherwise, they will end up at the wrong side of the equation. And it'll be the opposite. Instead of being a dyslexic in trouble, it'll be a linear person in trouble who can't make a living and goes to prison because they just didn't have the adaptation skills.
Mm-hmm. I find this fascinating, this idea of really, let's say, understanding how your brain works and, let's say, playing to your strengths. When I was a kid, I was always getting in trouble. I was always kind of the weird kid in the corner of the classroom.
A perfect profile. You just stayed out of prison.
Well, yes. So far, I've managed that. But I guess the way that I learned how to learn, which I think is extremely important for myself and something I really want to, let's say, emphasize for this show is that idea of learning how to learn. When I was going through my welding career, I had the, let's say, privilege in a lot of places of putting my earbuds in and being able to listen to podcasts and audiobooks and get a completely different education and experience than just sitting under my welding helmet and listening to music or the noise in the shop for the entire day. And I think this idea of being able to learn and to intake engrossing information that was interesting to me while also being able to do a menial task that didn't necessarily require a lot of really active thinking. When I've had this conversation with you before, you said that this is a very lateral way of learning and thinking, right?
Absolutely. And, when you describe it, I describe the learn to learn program. Mm-hmm. So lateral people have a learn to learn program, as in they've learned and then they learn again and they keep learning and they keep questioning. And there's something that I noticed somewhere around the mid-40s, people and friends I knew that were linear really stopped questioning and stopped learning. Mm-hmm. Although they looked young, their brains had stopped really adapting. Whereas the hallmark of a lateral person is they can be 80 and still questioning and still fascinated by the world. And I describe that difference as a lateral learn to learn program. And what it does is it keeps wanting to populate the algorithm, because the algorithm is three-dimensional. So one piece of information that goes into the three-dimensional cube of knowledge can actually change the whole thing. It's fully neuroplastic and changes. So when you were welding, you were repopulating, it was changing, it was moving, and your mind was exercising as well as your concentration on the welding, which is, I think, a very typical lateral way of learning. And it's really exciting because you're less likely to suffer from dementia. I'd love to do studies of lateralization and dementia because you are forcing your brain to constantly work even until your last breath at 90 or 95, if you're well enough to do it. And I think that's really exciting. And I think maybe if we could encourage learn to learn programs in education for more linear people, they would benefit from that process too. To what extent you can synthesize it, I do not know. I don't know whether we are born neurologically hardwired differently or whether this is a case of internal shaping. I suspect it's genetic and hardwired, but that doesn't mean we couldn't do a lot more to help people being less linear in the way they think and experience life.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, many of the Asian philosophies and the ideas which are expansive tend to be more lateral. And so, they naturally it's an interesting process. Not the ones that just follow blindly, the ones that truly feel and believe and evolve through spiritual evolution. It suits, again, it's another lateral dynamic.
Mm-hmm. David, how do you think about let's say, the way in which you focus your mind, or the way that, let's say, dyslexic or people that have a different way of learning, how do you point your mind into the right direction? I mean, there's so many distractions nowadays, with the ability to never be bored, to always be on social media, to always be scrolling, to be intaking bullshit information, really. Let's say lower quality information, instead of being able to focus on something that ends up being productive in the end.
So I often think about, why did I choose to study physics?
Mm-hmm.
And I now understand, because it was, the ultimate at the linear construct of understanding, and also at its edges, it demanded a lateral exposure of how those ideas could evolve too.
Mm-hmm.
So I managed to combine with my education a lateral thought process, which I honed naturally, and a linear discipline that meant that, for example, my search radar would come up with an idea or construct, and then I would examine those pieces of the construct with a very strict mental discipline to make sure that the pillars of it worked. And the combination was reinforcing. And one of the problems I think that we have today is that we have one of the most extreme societies in terms of linearization, thanks to money printing, in anywhere in history. And money printing has let linear people who are non-adaptive stay as politicians, stay as business heads, stay ahead of the military, and the compensatory dynamic of normally failure has been extended because printed money made it look like things continue to be successful. And the net result is lateralized thinking has been ejected from society's norms. And I find lots of lateral people who really have been launched out and they're in a field, a bit stunned, and they disappear down all sorts of strange rabbit holes.
Mm-hmm.
And they do lateral people a great disservice, because that's when the linear people said, he's a Looney Tune. She's a Looney Tune. I mean, why does she believe in that? And I would, at that stage, have filtered out the components and say, for example, I'm a huge advocate that UAPs are real, and that we face a massive issue over congressional hearings and cover-ups, because the evidence is overwhelming from a linear perspective. And it doesn't matter whether people don't want to believe it, the evidence in front of us comes from the military, comes from multi-sensors, it's real. But I filtered it with my linear discipline to make sure it was real. But I hear an awful lot of people like Davos Man taking over the world. Davos Man is a thoroughly linear beast. He's unable to have a strategic construct that sees beyond getting home after Davos. So he would not be taking the world over. So that doesn't tick the box. Mm-hmm. And I've developed that further with my global forecaster model, because I built worldviews on how histories and empires unfold, which extends to now, predicts the future, the market constructs are mixed, and I have this incredible baseline with which, when someone says something, I can measure whether I think it is real, substantial, or not. Mm-hmm. And so how do people not have the ability to select correctly what they watch? They don't have the linear discipline to filter out the rubbish, and they don't have a context to say that is out of context. That is likely to be unreal. Like some of the pictures you look at, weird pictures, you think, it's out of context because time doesn't go backwards. The matches don't jump back in the box. Mm-hmm. That's a very clear visual example of what I'm talking about. And that doesn't come easily. It requires work. And I go back to some degree, having the computing power to drive the program. But again, I think your brain is like a muscle. The more you use it, for all of us, we can all do this. Mm-hmm. So there's, just because I happen to have pioneered or be aware of being the forefront of this conscious process, doesn't mean it isn't available to everyone else who wishes to follow down the route.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's what I think is most important, is exposing ourselves to these different, let's say, frameworks of understanding, to be able to harness how we think and how we learn into, productive facets, instead of just wasting time, as I said, on social media or anything like that.
And one of the most corrosive things I think we face today is the issue of the truth. Mm-hmm. and self-responsibility, because the truth is important, not because I can say I'm right and you're wrong, but because actually the truth is also a measure of, are we correct or not in our worldview? Can we learn from the failures? Can we take responsibility and grow? And so one of the problems when you obfuscate the truth, as is happening not just in Trump's regime, but also, for example, in the UK, in Starmer's left regime, is actually the truth disappears. You can't evaluate success or failure. And how can you evolve? And if you can't evolve, you can't adapt. And if you can't adapt, you're really just walking dead people. So the truth is actually very important. The search for the truth has to be, I think, a key pillar of this questioning as to what is or isn't real. And it's never been more so than now. I mean, when I was younger, you could trust the BBC. I don't trust the BBC if I could throw my television out the window because they have a bias. And things that we should be able to trust, we can't trust. And with AI images, you really have to question what you see and work out whether it makes sense. I see more and more of them. And luckily, the filters I have let me say, that's not real. That's not real. That could be real. And then I can look it up on the web and see whether it is and see whether it's a piece in the jigsaw puzzle I wish to integrate. So we need that more than ever. And when I started Global Forecaster, its main mission was to explain we have historical cycles, explain what they were, and explain how they went forwards. I never thought it would become a touchstone for what's real and not real. And that is a role I did not expect. And it doesn't mean I'm the ultimate oracle, but it does mean I can filter out 99% of bullshit that doesn't make sense because I have all these contextual links that have to cross-reference something that doesn't work. So, my work has been a personification of my thought process, and they've all sort of come to one point at a time when perhaps they're most relevant for other people too.
Well, as you're describing this, the idea of truth and how that serves us and also misguides us at the moment, how does this fit into, let's say, the cycles and stages of empire and how these empires are, or let's say what stage the empires at this point are entering?
Well, okay, so let's just think about, a mound, like a curve, and the front face is the rising system and the back face is a declining system.
Looks like a belt.
Yeah, exactly. So on the rise, once you get past the first stage of regionalization, the system becomes very lateralized after being through a civil war. And lateral adaptive people are grounded in reality and self-responsibility and innovation to achieve goals, to move themselves and their country to the top of the stack. And where do you find like a brilliant sportsman who doesn't have an honesty about how they perform, an internal awareness of what's good or bad, and a process where they want to keep themselves on track to be consistently performing? That's exactly the mindset of all the great leaders of systems, which then echoes and cascades down to the people under them. That's the expansive model. The contractive model is I'm not contracting. I don't see I'm contracting. I didn't make any mistakes. Someone else did it. I'm a victim. There's nothing to learn because I'm perfect. And that's how it's constructed. So one of the problems with victim psychology is, where does the victim take responsibility for being the victim? What lesson can the victim extract from the situation that created them to become a victim? And as soon as you start to do that, you start to not being a victim. Now you're taking responsibility, if there is any to be taken, and it could be as much as, I didn't learn enough self-defense to make sure I could fend off this attacker, or whatever, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's where society has to go to grow and evolve. And today we are in a contractive Western world. America is in terminal decline, the worst state of that. A sense that, victimhood, which Trump has harnessed, a sense of lack of responsibility, a lack of touchstone with the greatest times, for example, in America. If you were to think about when was America great, it was the times of Reagan, the values of Reagan. So instead of saying what makes us great, go back to a time where you were great in your estimation and adopt and assimilate those values as a culture, and you'll change direction. But nowadays, look at Trump. Look at the decision he took to bomb Iran. I'm actually an advocate for Iran not having nuclear weapons, but I think he should have done it a long time earlier. And his delay and appeasement in actually acting has meant the Israelis had to go to total war with Iran because they couldn't get to the sites any other way. And it's a full-scale regional war when courage could have resulted in a specific bombing that forced the Iranians back to the table in a different way. I don't think what he did was out of strength. It came essentially through FOMO, as in you're missing out because Bibi was getting all the credit. And from there, it was this idea of be a cheap, quick victory that would give him a win when we used our technology with no risk whatsoever, because the air defenses had disappeared thanks to the IDF. And even if they did have air defenses, a B-2 would fly through them with impunity. So the idea there was a risk taken and everything else is, again, is a political construct to feed the ego of Trump. That's not what you would see in a system that was going upwards. A system that was going upwards would have intervened very quickly early on and demonstrated either remove it or we'll remove it for you, and made it very simple.
Well, and I think this comes back to the idea of truth as well, because it was reported that they struck these 3 nuclear enrichment facilities. And as we get more reports of the actual circumstances around what was actually achieved, it seems like it's not at all close to what was initially claimed.
Well, I think they definitely disabled whatever facilities they bombed. But the thing they missed, and it seems to be like complete absent from the Washington mindset, is we're not dealing with Americans that live in Iran in a parallel system. We're dealing with jihadist mullahs that are in some religious war, and they're prepared to have a completely different risk reward because this life doesn't matter compared to the next. And that's exactly why we didn't want to let them have nuclear weapons, because they would have destroyed mutually assured destruction. And at the same time, they're going to fight differently. So they are now fully committed to their war. And really, did we expect them just to leave their valuable centrifuges and uranium in a place where it was obviously going to get bombed? No, they moved it. And, the trucks outside 40 tell us they moved something. They moved centrifuges and they must have used uranium. Nothing was in the sites that were bombed. And that means that this isn't a quick win. Bibi knew that, by the way, when he seduced Trump in. And he is an extremely good manipulator of Trump by feeding his ego. Brilliant when you look at him. And Trump has bit hook, line, and sinker. And now there's going to be an escalation as we hunt these nuclear weapons towards regime change and the Gulf closing, which leads the next window to a cascade if the Chinese choose this to be their Archduke Ferdinand moment. So no, I don't think Trump is strong. And I think actually having a man of such terrible psychology and failing at a time when we're on the cusp of the next step into World War III is a disaster for the Western world. In fact, the whole world.
Well, I mean, you mentioned this idea perfectly of this disaster for not only the West, but the whole world. And this kind of brings us to the idea of needing to be resilient. And again, the general idea of competency, being able to apply your skill set to any task, no matter what that task looks like, I think is exactly, the point of what I aim to achieve with this show. So how do we think about, let's say, building resilience and the importance of resilience in this time, especially of, escalating conflict through the world?
It's a fantastic question. And I'm going to just go back one step because it's quite instructive. If you look at Trump's background, he is, given a lot of money and his business track record is diabolical. If you want something to go bust, give it to Trump. And yet, Trump managed to use a television persona to persuade people he was brilliant. And a very good example of the opposite of what you just expounded is actually persona and perception have dominated capability and competence, which is why we are in decline, because we can't recognize it and we don't value it and we're missold it, because we all think we want to be competent. We think it's our right to be competent. It's our right to be happy and successful. But competence is earned. Competence is a mindset from the earliest age, driven to be the best you can be, driven to be curious about how you can be the best you can be. And it requires a critical sense that says, well, I wasn't good at this. I need to fix this. I need to work harder at it. So competence is about a goal that I think I know that I've always had. My hero, and you're going to laugh, but I'll share it with you in public, was always James Bond. And it wasn't because he shagged every beautiful woman in town. I mean, that was a coincidental, wouldn't that be nice? What really impressed me about him, was he was academically as brilliant as anyone he met. He was incredibly self-reliant and competent. He could fix things he needed to fix to make his missions work. He was an operator on the edge of technology and bold and adventurous. And so for me, he lacked emotional intelligence on the soft side, which I valued actually at the same time. But as a version of a man that was essentially capable, whatever he did, determined in his outcome, I think he was a fascinating icon that I really valued. And I tried to express that in categorizing the competencies I wish to have as academic competencies, practical competencies, because I used to love making and doing things, and athletic competencies and relational competencies. And so I chose, four and a couple of other 4 areas or whatever that I was aware of I really needed to be competent at. And that was my goal. I left language out because there was no hope I could be a linguist, so that didn't figure. But essentially, I worked hard at that process and questioned why things didn't work. And it involved a huge number of failures that didn't work out the way I would have liked them to be before I was successful. But that mode of thinking and operation, that ability of trying and falling over and trying and falling over and aspiring and achieving and working out, that's the genesis of competency. And it requires resilience to basically be prepared to risk and fall over and see yourself as failed and to learn from those failures. So I think the first thing that develops resilience is that mindset. And I'm always intrigued when I see it in people. And so, very simply, you rarely see resilience in people that haven't had hard times. And much as we would like to avoid hard times are what tempers us. It's where resilience and that process I talked about is truly honed at the edge of our emotional tolerance. So it can't just be an easy. We need to be pushed. We need to find ourselves. We need to cope with our emotions. We need to deal with these things in a raw sense, and hopefully in a constrained sense that doesn't take it out on everyone else around you when it doesn't work. Because that's the other thing about competency, is being self-contained emotionally, that you don't leak all your feelings out around people all the time and sub them to your state of being. Part of that is being self-contained enough and self-aware enough to know how you feel. You may be agitated and angry, but not to take it out on someone that's not related to what your issue is. So emotional competency and awareness is critical. And I think if you wrap those things up together, and this doesn't just come tomorrow, it's a way of life. And the gift my father gave me was by going to a school that was challenging for every day and every minute. I knew what hardship was when it came to people and existing and having to fight for my existence physically and, understanding what children's taunts were to counter them or to not. And it was horrible. But I wouldn't take that away, and I couldn't subject my own children to it. I realized it was a very critical part of my personal evolution. And in a strange way, if you think about conflict, and one of the things that we all have to face is we are moving into a phase where conflict is prolific around us. It's not just Ukraine, it's not just Israel and Iran, it's going to spread much further afield, I'm afraid. And so we need to be prepared to understand the lessons of resilience of our forebears. And there's a study which I've been doing about the resilience of populations under bombing and how people adapt. And it is quite remarkable in Ukraine or in Gaza, or how we change our value sets to the levels that we need to survive, and things that would be abnormally terrifying reduced to acceptable terror or maintenance. We all have these survival mechanisms within us, but it's not where we go over time from A to B, because given gentle exposure, most people will move in that state. The real problem is how you face it when it really suddenly bursts upon you. And you've got to adapt because it's real today and it wasn't real yesterday. That's where resilience truly pays off.
Well, and I think a perfect example of that, it was something I read about. I think it was, don't quote me on the actual name of the battle, but I think it was the Battle of Britain or something, where London was being shelled. Everybody was hiding in basically bomb shelters. And the psychologists that were kind of watching this expected the suicide rate to peak incredibly high. And what they ended up getting was the exact opposite. People were, oddly enough, that in a way brought them back to the idea of community, which is extremely important as humans to be able to be a part of. And the other part of it, I think, was this idea of developing resilience through really being tested. And the actual outcome was a dramatically lower rate of suicide after that particular
Well,
time.
you're dead right, and that's exactly what did happen. It's interesting that the government wouldn't let the London population go down the undergrounds in the first bombings. In the end, it took them like a period of weeks before the population got into safe havens because the government didn't want to break some rules or thought it was going to be dangerous. But one of the things that's quite interesting about that is I think resilience comes by understanding and being able to exhibit being in the present. Because when you think about it, you are in the present, you have a problem, and you solve the problem.
Mhm.
Not being in the present is thinking about all the problems you might have that you might solve, that isn't where you live. And somewhere in this condition of extremis where we are threatened or in conflict, I'm sure that people live in the present more than they've ever done. In fact, they probably truly live in a way they haven't done in the day-to-day existence of extensualizing the future and the worries and all the other processes of a hard-lived life.
Mhm.
So in this is a secret, and it's a reminder that we have so many lucky things to be alive. And when we're dead, we don't have them. And we suddenly appreciate what we have. We live in the present and we share our emotions and we feel we express it. And think that war does that in a shape that you don't see the textbooks talk about. And the more present you can be in the present, the more resilient you're going to be, as long as the other part of your brain has a plan that when the bomb drops, you know where the bomb shelter is or how to get to it. It's not totally in the present, but living now rather than being full of fear and full of what ifs and full of I should have's. And I think that's a very key part of the skill of resilience, on top of the other skills we've talked about.
Well, this idea of, let's say, deliberate exposure to not necessarily just conflict, but hardship in general is something that I love and I actually actively seek. I have, deliberately put myself into situations, let's say in the backcountry or in the mountains, in Baja, Mexico, for example. I did a big motorcycle trip this year where we had to be extremely self-reliant. We were given GPS tracks at the beginning of the day. We rode between 8 to 9 hours every single day for 5 days. And, this is a choice. This is something that I thought was fun to be able to be a part of and to do. And most importantly, to challenge myself with. And this kind of goes back to the idea of, building resilience and this voluntary exposure. How do you think, or how have you thought about, let's say, building resilience in your children to be able to, for them to be able to, when they're adults, have this skill and be competent in being able to be challenged in their lives and to be able to rise in the face of any type of situation that they're facing?
It's a great question. And I mean, one of the reasons why I think we get on so well is we both value this quality of male resilience, which comes through testing ourselves. And no amount of telling my children how they should be is going to encourage them to be resilient. The only way that it's going to work is if I demonstrate what resilience is. And my father was a very resilient and capable man. And we were brought up sailing in the days where you didn't have GPSs, and you sailed across the channel in a little boat in the fog, and it was truly like off the charts adventurous. All my early years, I sailed. It was wet. We didn't have the clothing. And it was a tough existence. I was a Boy Scout, and I used to be like a serious windsurfer, which was cutting edge sailing. So I found myself always at the edges, like you, of pushing myself to those places and wanting to do it, even though it involved overcoming fear. That voluntary process of going to the edge, under control, and taking yourself to the edge is part of those resilience tests. And it took me, to learn to dive early on, and all sorts of lessons along the way that almost took my life. And that same energy made me very comfortable in Papua New Guinea. It was probably the most extreme environment I could have conjured up. Again, I was happy to go there for reasons which, we both share. So how have my children responded? Well, they've all been brought up sailing. They've all had that tradition of being on a boat, of being in an environment, of being pushed. I remember there was one round the island race when Horatio and Winston, my sons, and we'd gone east about the Isle of Wight. So you beat round the back of the island against the tide, and it was monumentally so rough. The waves were coming down the leeward side and the top side. I had my racing crew of 12 people and my boys. H was more than 6, and Winnie was like 12, on the rail, being drenched to the extremis. And I remember thinking, no man would leave his boys exposed like this apart from me, because they need to be confident, and they've grown up to be confident. Winston just went into the Navy, and he's adapted because he is. Part of that is they play rugby as well, so they're used to physical adaptation. And I'm a huge fan of rugby as one of those resilient qualities in teamship and hardship and overcoming, all the issues around that. Mm-hmm. So the combination of the two has made both my boys resilient. But in answer to your question, you can't teach them, you can only show them. You can only be resilient and aspire to be resilient as a father, and hope that's the model that they then adopt.
Well, of course, leading by example is something that I'm, very, very conscious of and try to embody. But on the other side of this, I think giving children, and this is obviously just my opinion, giving children the ability to problem solve, to put them in a situation where they have to develop some type of resilience or learn from a particular situation, I think is the most important part. Instead of just picking them up every time they fall and solving every problem for them, that is short-term positive, long-term extremely detrimental.
So agree with you. And as a parent, and I brought my children up for like a whole period of time as a single dad, mm-hmm. and then they would go to their mother. So there was really quite one of the interesting things of being a male that combined sort of academic and professional sort of career with an adventurous career, and now having to be a dad mum. Man, that was one of the biggest challenges ever. Because, I don't do pairing socks or school uniforms, but I had to. And it was bloody awful. And yet I was determined to do it because I wanted the privilege of that time where it was an uncompromised period of bringing my children up. And it was quite interesting because I didn't compromise on any values. And it was the most relaxed environment. And they understood, what it was, whether they liked me or not as their dad. And I've always encouraged them to push their limits. And they are definitely secure enough and are doing that. But as you quite rightly say, at what stage are you doing your child a favor when you pick them up, when they need to pick themselves up? Mm-hmm. And I know I was left with incredible autonomy. I mean, I look back and I used to cycle to school when I was 9, and the school was 5 miles away. Well, I used to disappear off into the woods all day and no mobile phones and just turn up for dinner. Yep. So I was given that, and I actually replicated the process to the point where other parents might consider me, rather irresponsible. But I believed my children were capable. They were given common sense, and to stifle them ultimately would be the biggest sin, because you felt like you wanted to, in effect, make their life easier when you want to give them a controlled space to make it harder and test themselves. But always be there if they need you to pick them up and then learn and then go back out there and do it again.
Mm-hmm. Kind of act as a guardrail of sorts to be able to keep them from, let's say, ultimate safety, but give them the room to be able to hurt themselves, to be able to learn from, any of these hardships or resistance that they're going to encounter.
So true. I think the other thing too is that my father was a very, wise and intelligent man for his generation. But I mean, we're talking about very little parenting construct, very little advice. And whereas what I have tried to do is in my quest to distill knowledge into its essential elements, where I've been able to find basic principles that I wish I'd had early on, I've tried to instill them. So they all know that their most important decision will be their choice of their partner. And they can't just respond in the process of love. They need to understand things about themselves and their opposite sex parent and the choices they make before they choose freely for themselves rather than unconsciously. Now, I wish I'd had just a fraction of that information. I've given them information about who you trust and who you don't trust, mm-hmm. based on some of the models on my site. As in, I think there's 20% of the population that you can't trust. 18 of the 20% will make it look like you can trust them sometimes and burn your house down. And 2% are malignant predators that you shoot on sight. And everyone else is a spectrum where you can give them allowance of trust. If you have confidence,
what's the remaining percentage of people that you can trust at that point?
the ones you can truly trust are probably 10% that would reciprocate the kind of trust you would like to have, that you would, where you stand by someone in extremis. It's going to be small. But the others are right circumstance. There'd be the people in a war that took you in as you escaped the enemy, but they felt it was right. But you need to highlight you're not with the 20% who just dobbed you in, or the 2% who shot you before they even bothered to dob you in. Yeah. So it's learning those survival skills, which hopefully have given them an early set of understandings, which then stop them from suffering really traumatic suffering, which actually doesn't help. It actually disables because it creates inhibitions and scar tissue emotionally. Mm-hmm. So I've also tried to combine that where possible. And I think relatively, I suspect they've taken that on board and so far seem to in their choices. So, wisdom is generational. If we seek wisdom as parents, we need to give it in a distilled form that they can accept as children, not shoved down their throat. It's there for them if they want it. And learning isn't from a book, it's generational. And again, by example. So we must live by the example we wish our children to live. That's really important.
I couldn't agree more. And the example that you brought up of finding a partner that you can work with and that works well with you, when let's say you identify yourself as a lateral thinker that is maybe outside of the normal or quote unquote normal let's say psychological sphere that they see everybody else around them being a part of. What types of qualities are extremely important in a partner when we're talking about people like you and I that think about the world and see the world a little bit differently?
Well, the first thing I think, we're lateral people. And as lateral thinkers, we spend the early part of our life feeling probably a bit of a square peg in a round hole. Mm-hmm. We don't quite feel like other people. We don't understand that it's not just you and I. We're a subset that feels different from others. And so one of the experience most lateral people don't realize is we're just a subset. We think we had individual experiences, but actually they're remarkably common. Mm-hmm. And one of the commonest experiences I note is that lateral people choose linear partners early on because unconsciously they feel they're better adapted than they are. And then they make a pact. But the trouble is that the lateral person usually outgrows the linear person. And as they outgrow, they end up with a changing dynamic and the separation of the relationship ensues. So I would encourage lateral people to pair with lateral people and linear people to pair with linear people, because the difference is very fundamental, more fundamental than anything else in my experience. And that's the first biggest step. I mean, if I had understood that, my life would have taken a completely different course. And I've encouraged my children to understand what that is and how it feels. Mm-hmm. Part of that also is an emotional language, because we are all going to have problems. We're all going to make mistakes. We're going to do things we regret with our partners, and we need to be able to talk about what we feel and how we navigate out and what we've learned. So an emotional language that is much more a lateral language. For men, it's of a female empathy, in effect. It's really strongly to be harnessed, not to be looked at and think there's something wrong with me. Actually, it's one of the great gifts of being lateral with this hemispherical dynamic, because most women that I've encountered wish to have emotional awareness in their partners. And that's something that lateral men are able to do. Lateral women are super emotionally, like they're almost, they need a lateral man to match them, and probably older, because they are in overdrive when it comes to this particular quality. Mm-hmm. So it's understanding who we are, what we need, but having a language and an honesty whereby we can grow and a commitment to grow, even though we might be different in it. Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing is to be able to share the present. Like relationships you want to be in, you see them together and they're in the present, loving each other in the present. Just so important to be in the present. And if you can love in the present, it brings with it all sorts of incredible benefits. and not love for the future, not love for the past, be in the present, and be able to find those moments within your relationship in between living a life, which is obviously challenging. That's the nourishing possibility, which I've learned to experience and value greatly.
David, is there more of a preponderance for lateral thinkers within men than there is women? And is there, let's say, a smaller percentage of women that are possibly lateral and therefore making it more difficult for men to find a, let's say, ideally compatible lateral thinker in a woman?
Now, I think the proportions are probably pretty similar.
Okay.
But there is a hallmark that there are like 7 left-handed percent and 3 left-handed women, which is really interesting. And I think that most women are far more lateral than men, period, on the spectrum. But a very lateral woman will be more lateral than a lateral man. So, because they start with more hemispherical connections. I think they're out there. It's just a question of understanding what you need. Now, I know that women are brilliant at selecting men in that they have a list. And, when they find their partner, there is a list that all women have ticked off. And men are completely different. We chug along and we have omnidirectional radar on our head and we get a ping because the woman pings us and we go, oh, and we home in. And then it makes it look like we're the ones doing the chatting up, but we're not. We've had the ping, we moved in. If you ever move in to a woman without a ping as a man, you're wasting your time 99.9% because you haven't been selected. So what's really interesting is then you go out, you have a wonderful time, you sleep together, you fall in love, and you never, ever selected your partner as a man. Now, I know this because that was my earlier life. And finally, in my 50s, I worked it out that I needed to actually make a choice. I needed to decide what I wanted. I needed to take a leaf from women's books that were really quite careful about who they chose. And after all, they had to carry babies for 9 months and bring them up. So it was a good reason why they should invest and be more choosy than men that effectively could bugger off and go hunting with another tribe and not ever even do anything about it. There's a genetic reason for this. It's not just me being sexist. I started to write down what I wanted to feel, the qualities I wanted, how I wanted, what I wanted to do, in really detail I'd never imagined, taking my life's experience. And I have her in my life now. And I'm very lucky. And what amazed me was how absolutely precisely this complex wish list, it manifested. So I strongly urge all men to take your own futures into your life and start to shape and mold what it is you would like to be, feel, and live and exhibit. Not do it about what you don't want. Start describing what you do want and fine-tune it and think about it and then put it away and forget about it. And then one day you'll wake up and you'll be surprised.
So, David, what do you chalk that up to? Is it the law of attraction? And by writing it down and being deliberate about thinking about the qualities that you want in a partner and the things you would like to feel, does that therefore attract that type of person to you? Is that what you think?
Well, first of all, you've taken the right of self-determination and you've taken control of your own determination, which, dare I say, I had no idea about. I wasn't really doing it. So it's it just wasn't operating on that level. So that's the first step. It's it's an intent. It's a desire to manifest a relationship with qualities that you list and think of and want. And then, yes, I think the power of attraction is really key. You've unconsciously molded what it is you would like to manifest. And then on the other side, the person that would like to manifest you on the other side finds you. And the key part of that is if you in any way are incomplete, if you feel you need someone else to complete you, that's a conditional transaction, and that brings different manifestations. So if you find yourself alone, rather than saying, how can I not be alone? I think the real solution is to learn to be very comfortable alone and very complete alone. And I remember before I went through this, the other thing I realized that happened to me before I met this person of my dreams or my ideals, less dreams because they were more like what I really manifest. I also had this incredible feeling of how comfortable I was being on my own. And if I was on the own for the rest of my life, I was perfectly comfortable.
Mhm.
And I met this encounter with those two energetic mindsets, which I think were not coincidental.
Well, I think that's extremely encouraging for not only myself, but probably a lot of people as well, is the idea of taking some self-determination, some self-responsibility, and taking some, again, something that I think is extremely important, some action around being deliberate about who you want in your life, what you want to feel. And, I guess the other side of that equation or is that manifesting itself within the world, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah, and the other part of it is patience,
Mhm.
because we're so into doing. So we do with a
Yeah.
dating app, or we do, and it's not happening, and there's frustration. If you, and I really do believe this, the universe has serendipity.
Mhm.
So if you are in the space you're meant to be in, and you find this space and you frame it, I mean, I was 55 before I worked this out. So believe me, you're all ahead of me out there because I'm an old bastard. So I'm giving you like a massive legs up on this. This process is not like tricking the universe. It's not like going through a process because you get an outcome. It's actually entering into a state of being that then manifests what your being needs.
Mhm.
And I can't emphasize that enough, because our mating drives, our unmet emotional needs from childhood to adult, they are all over this problem. And you have to have done the work to somehow get rid of those too, because we all have a child and we all have an adult. And at the time, our child stomps all over our adult with all sorts of problems.
Mhm.
Now, we're not going to get rid of those, but you're going to be aware of them and keep them in check. So, and I think the other thing too is, in this world, how do you see through someone as to whether they're genuine or not?
Mhm.
And the answer to that is time, because time always drops the masks that people present.
Sure
And
does.
as you go through it and you become better and you stop projecting in the first place, our greatest problem is when we project what we want onto someone else. And that image is what gives them the camouflage to be someone else.
Mhm.
So just drop the projection. And the combination in that mix, I wish I could have articulated to myself when I was 20, but I couldn't because I had no idea. I had to go through the lessons. But like everything else in my life, I've tried to assimilate lessons that I thought were substantial enough to be able to explain them to my children,
Mhm.
or in this case, on a talk like this.
Well, there's a quote that comes to mind as you're explaining that, and that was by Neil Strauss, and it was one of the last physical books that I read that I could not put down. It was called The Truth, and it was a book about relationships written through his story about having multiple partner relationships, living in the same house with four women, how that ended up being an absolute disaster,
Funny that.
despite being let's say many men's dreams. But it's this arc of a story that you also learn a lot through, and it was a very entertaining and also interesting and educational book. But the particular quote that comes to mind was actually a tweet of Neil Strauss, that he said, "You should be okay with your partner as they are, and not as you want them to be. And if you're not okay with them as they are, then you shouldn't be with them. If they change throughout the relationship for the positive, that's a bonus, but you should be okay with them as
So
they are."
true. So true, Tom. You know, it's sort of wanting to change someone is actually a most dire affliction,
Mhm.
because you put pressure on them and you change them to what? Something you want.
Mhm.
Love them for who they are, be where they are, and also encourage them to grow, but be wary, because encourage them to grow, they may grow away from you. They may grow into someone that, but isn't that love, where we love someone unconditionally and we encourage them on their path to grow, whether that takes them towards you or away from you?
Mhm.
And that's much more, I think, a measure of the encounter of love. And if there's one thing I'm absolutely convinced about, the fabric of humanity's existence is love, because love bonds us. It allows us to work together in teams, in families, which create great anti-entropic outcomes, which allow us to live and exist. And so the Buddha was right about love. Love is the glue in human fabric of society. And for those that don't experience it when they're younger, the terrible scars it brings, because how do you find it when you're older, and what you go through, it isn't impossible, but what a huge uphill path. compared to those that have received love from their parents,
Mhm.
which comes back to this thing where really should we just let people parent without some profiling and send them to school to explain to them that what happens in the first 5 years is the formative years for their emotional profile. And if you do certain things, you sabotage your children forever, whatever you do afterwards. And I really feel that, the Princess of Wales in this country is a charity focusing on the first 5 years of child evolution. If we wish to invest in our future society, explaining how parents need to bring children up, not just physically, but in terms of expression of feeling and love, dictates the nature of our future society.
Mhm.
And we need to educate ourselves, A, as to what we define as being the optimum outcomes, but B, so that people understand that. Not that we pick up the pieces afterwards in a social system that's broken people because we're just not aware of it.
Mhm. Well, I think that also comes back to the idea of being deliberate about the types of leaders and the types of people that we want growing up in our society. I think as as an uncle myself, I want to be able to have some type of an influence on my nephew to be able to give him the tools, the resilience, the framework of understanding through which he's able to be as successful as he can be.
And he's going to be so lucky to have you as an uncle because you're the perfect uncle that would take that interest. It's brilliant.
Well,
Brilliant.
it's always a challenge though. And
So it should be.
my ideas aren't necessarily congruent with my sisters, but either way, I try to be very deliberate about the lessons that I am able to impart to him.
But also, deliberate lessons are one thing, but also, a great thing about an uncle is you come and go, and you go when the nappies need to be changed or it gets ugly. But you can have the great times that leave an impression about the joy of life,
Yeah.
and you're full of joy and adventure. So on the back of the bike, all those things are just a brilliant image of an uncle.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, you made me think about something I feel really strongly about, and that is imagine a society that was able to pick up the qualities in a child of narcissism in an early stage, that basically understood the parental construct that was beginning to send that child into a place of lack of love and affirmation that would ultimately run through to create a Donald Trump or, a Hitler or someone that profoundly destroyed so many people's lives.
Mm-hmm.
And imagine a society that not just identified them, but then was able to put them into some corrective process where they could be loved and taken away from parents that didn't love them. What a difference, because those few people that rise to power, that are driven to power because of the lack of affirmation that as a child, then inflict that pain that they felt all their life on everyone else. To take those people away could change the fabric of our society. Because within the 20% I talk about, most of them fit into some version of that category.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of a competent man theory for how we could socially engineer ourselves to be more aware, to have more love that people feel, because love isn't a word, it's a feeling, and we need to feel it. It doesn't work if someone says, I love you, and you don't feel it because the energy isn't flowing. So understanding that better and would be a really wonderful image for our societies.
Mm-hmm. But this kind of brings me, as you're explaining this, brings me back to the idea of, the saying of hard times make hard men and easy times make easy men. And this, I think this is an underlying symptom of much of our society right now. And I've explained it before as, a lack of meaning because people don't have any struggle, anything to push against. As humans, I think we evolved to be able to be solving problems constantly, to be fighting off predators, to be finding food, solving these problems. And we've come to a place in our society where we are so comfortable and able to have every single one of our needs met without expending almost any energy, that I think this is also manifesting in the way we're bringing up children, where it's all comfort, it's all having every problem solved for you. And of course, I think there's a part of our species that also strives to be able, or to want to be able to give that sense of security and ability to be safe and be comfortable to our children, but that in the end doesn't do them any favors.
The whole protective concept of giving your children what you didn't have, making sure they're safe, their natural parenting desires. But they have got to be tempered with not your natural unconscious urges, but basically a conscious decision of how do I give my children, as you quite rightly say, and bringing it back to the origins, as we come to the end of the conversation, is essentially how do I give my children maximum resilience for the day I'm not there? Because it's great, but what happens when I die? And we are, as parents, our job is to bring up the next generation, to make them better than us, make them stronger, to damn the unconscious patterns which came from a previous generation behind us and stop with us because we work through them, giving them a freer landscape to more early on discover who they are and follow their path rather than some unconscious conditioning from 2 generations back. That's what we have to do to help resilience. And we have to also let them have hard lessons. We need to, and for boys, rugby there's nothing better than watching them go out and beat the shit out of each other and having it beaten out of them and yet come through it. And that includes broken bits all over the place, or my son going over the handlebars on his bike, or you name it, because both you and I did that when we were children. And everything went wrong and broke all sorts of things. And that's part of a boy. Girls are much more conservative about breaking themselves. And so they don't realize that they'll heal naturally. For you and I, we know that actually it bloody hurts. If you lie still long enough, you'll pop up just as you were a little bit later in most circumstances.
What an amazing idea that we've kind of come to is the idea of tempering comfort and tempering the need to want to be so protective of our children and the next generation. And I think that's so important to be able to understand in this greater context of creating resilient humans.
Yeah. And for example, for me, watching my older son join the services and join the Navy was exactly that combination. He'd been brought up with my worldview, but I can't now protecting our society. And, he's well suited to it, but I could have put aside the parental construct because it's not my job to protect him. He's now protecting our society. And that's a really interesting turnaround. And of course, that's what, as parents, we hope for, fully functioning children who become young adults who then take the lead and take control of society because we're not going to be here. That's what children are there for. So when they do it, it makes us very proud, makes me very proud. But I had to go through mental hurdles to cut the severs and the links to understand what was happening consciously. So again, for all those parents that see their children go into harm's way in the services and become, young, brave adults in the process, I would imagine everyone has gone through something like that. Just it isn't publicly articulated.
Well, that's a perfect way to kind of let's say end a day of hard thinking and deliberate thought. So as we're wrapping up here, David, what do you think are some of the most important skills to be deliberate about, to be trying to develop, to be conscious of as we go through this, basically higher period of conflict, and where the much of the West is going to be experiencing this decline of an empire?
So first of all, we've got to be disciplined in our own minds. And we need to be courageous in our own minds, because when we open our eyes, the scenario that we face if we've been asleep is pretty bad. We are unprepared. Our enemies are coming for us. War is spreading like a virus. China is at the center of that process, and global conflict is practically inevitable at this late stage. And we are not prepared. So each of us have to be prepared in our own minds and have the courage to face the situation we're in and to realize that's 51% of the problem solved, because now we can start adapting. And adapting means learning the lessons from our ancestors that enable us to choose the right leaders, make the right decisions, and deal with a terrible time ahead, I suspect, where we will suffer great loss. But knowing that our ancestors went through it too, and they survived the trials and adapted. And I truly believe that if you look at the fate of mankind, it is not to be autocratic. It is to have individuals who are extremely competent and resilient, that rise to the fore and lead the free world to its freedom once more. And we have failed to recognize the values of those people, and we've disregarded them in our society now for at least 3 decades.
Mhm.
So we need to encourage them to come to the fore. If you don't feel you are a person, encourage those people that are and support them. That's part of being resilient, is actually recognizing how you manifest collective resilience, because it's no use standing when everyone else falls. So those are really key, but it starts with the discipline of our own minds to face our fears. And once we face our fears, to have the courage to trust that our ancestors knew a way through, and therefore we can find a way through.
David, that's well said. I'm always grateful for time to get to speak with you and explore many of these ideas. And this conversation was no exception. I really thank you for your time today.
Well, I love speaking to you, Tom. It works both ways. It really is a pleasure just sharing ideas, and you do it so brilliantly on the show. So everyone who's listening to The Competent Man, in fact, you're obviously a very competent man too. Very quiet about this, but we wouldn't be doing this unless you weren't a competent man.
Well, that's my goal is to always become more competent. I don't think it's a finish line or
Well said.
A medal that I can wear around my neck. It's
Why don't we redefine it? An aspiring competent man.
ooh, that's
That's where we are.
I like it.
You
All right,
should
David.
read The Aspiring Competent Man.
Love it. David,
Have to
thanks so
change
much for your time today.
it.